an overview and tell you what I'm here to do and not do. So let me first start out by making really clear, I am here on behalf of a really, really large group of volunteers, both attorneys and the realtors. Now, I'm here representing that realtor contract working group, but we couldn't do this without the volunteer labor of a bunch of really excellent attorneys. And when we had invited kind of last minute, because I didn't want to get into questions without having an attorney or two on hand, which is not always the way we feel about things, but in this case, it is. And it was, oh, I'm sorry, David Thies can't be there, but Daniel Thies can. Well, Daniel's a Harvard law alum. I'm like, if the Harvard guy is us scraping the bottom of the barrel, I feel like we can be very thankful and consider that it's a very good day. So we have Daniel here, and I don't know how many of you have met him, but he has been involved through pretty much every step of this. And then Harold Adams will also be here as well. So those are two of several people that have sat on the attorney side of the, let's say, I guess they're technically the real estate committee of the Champaign County Bar Association.
So it's been great working with you too. I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So what we can and what we can't do. Obviously, we're not here to dispense legal advice. So just like when I'm given a contract orientation, we're not a substitute for legal advice. What we are here to do is, if you've given this new contract a read and you're thinking, what the blank were they thinking? Well, I'll be able to give you some insights into what they were thinking. And sometimes it will be imperfect, but really the best available after a lot of debate and discussion. So I'm able to give you rationale. I'm able to give you context. Some issues, God forbid, we won't know a real answer until they get litigated. And we hope they never get litigated. And so it'll be kind of best judgment, but here's why we did it this way. And here's generally what we were trying to accomplish. And sometimes that'll be by way of a contrast to a previous version of the contract. So can't give legal advice, but here to give information, respond to questions, which a lot of those will be in the category of based on. So I'm going to get things rolling. I encourage you to raise your virtual hand and I will watch for those, but you are also welcome when I'm hitting folks up for questions to just unmute yourself and start asking. So I'm going to run through some questions I got well in advance that I thought were probably very likely. So on line 56, a warranted component or system shall be deemed in operating condition if it performs the function for which it is intended, regardless of age. That's what happens when I have over-caffeinated. So the question that came from that is, does this mean that a furnace that's heating the house but has a cracked heat exchanger is to be considered an operating condition? Because I think the person who wrote the question is, well, because it's still generating heat. Does the AC that doesn't have the temperature differential that's recommended meet the category of operating condition? Does a faucet that fills a sink but sprays water elsewhere meet the definition? And so I would say in all of those cases, I think the consensus of both the realtors and the attorneys is, well, no. To say that it generates heat while potentially killing you is not going to fall within at least our sort of what we contemplated for, performs the function for which it was intended. And so same thing, a plumbing fixture that has a geyser when it was not designed as a water feature. So I think that's within reason. The example that comes up that came up on a recent transaction is, I've got a Sunview condominium that probably goes back to the 1980s. It's still rocking what is now a collector's item garage door opener. It is avocado green, which tells you something about the age of the garage door opener. And so unsurprisingly, it doesn't have optical auto reverse, and it doesn't even have pressure sensitive auto reverse. Now it will stop. It has pressure sensitive. It will stop and no longer push on your neck if you lie right there with your neck on the concrete, but it doesn't auto reverse, but it is in fact performing the function for which it was intended. And it's doing it exactly the way it was designed. It's just old enough to predate, the last two generations of safety features, versus something where never in the course of human history was that supposed to do that. And so in general, it's not intended to limit it that much. And a lot of the things that came up, to give you guys an example, 2 generations of contract ago, the late Richard Joy had come up with verbiage that was really a marvel because it was so inclusive by implication. But that meant you kind of had to read into it And it's not the same for us as realtors working with clients. It's not the same as saying more explicitly, this contemplates being able to do this or not being able to do that. So a lot of the changes around 5A2 and around the inspection contingency are because we've all sort of felt in the marketplace this change in sort of normal behavior of people asking for everything, to the point of, well, what part of not new did you not get when the listing said it was built in 1967? And so we needed to, and so this was done partially in response to sort of the pendulum swinging way far into the nitpicky buyer asking for anything or checking a box and walking away and leaving the seller holding the bag for a now stigmatized property back on the market that maybe missed all of the rest of peak season. But also we have undertaken a really exhaustive survey of other markets' contracts, and would like to think that in the course of pilfering, we've pilfered really the very best provisions from those, and then have had the benefit of some really, really excellent attorneys locally that have helped make sure those get fully integrated. Next question, what does invasive testing of building material mean? The question being, if a paint chip or drywall sample is removed for testing purposes, is it invasive? Yes. And so the idea is, in a normal home inspection, unless something goes unexpectedly wrong, in a normal home inspection, the inspector is testing things, looking at things, and operating things, putting windows up and down that are intended to be left exactly as they were found. You're not scraping off a piece of the property. You're not putting a hole in the property. You're not damaging a property. And so we're simply saying anything that requires that you scrape out a sample, you do have to get permission. But obviously, if a buyer says, I do want to take a sample to test for lead-based paint, or I'm particularly concerned about formaldehyde in this particular era of construction of drywall, or vermiculite in the attic insulation, it's not intended to make any of those things off limits. It's just intended to make clear that if you're going to be scraping, poking, or pulling things out of the property, that you do have to have permission for those. In lines 84 and 85, and this question was briefly discussed in the course of our drafting, but in lines 84 and 85, there's no reference to central heating and cooling systems. And so let me take you over to that. A qualifying deficiency, that's the paragraph. A qualifying deficiency shall include only deficiencies in the major components of the premises, and then there's a colon, central heating systems, central cooling systems, interior plumbing. I think there are two references. I'm sorry, the questioner. There are two references to central. Does it exclude those that are non? We talked about that in an earlier meeting, and it's not our intention to exclude that. It's intended to be part of the actual major heating system, but if that means that it is a non-central system that is permanently built into a sunroom, or we still find those occasionally from decades ago that were used to heat an attic, but it is a space heater, but it's a permanently plumbed in gas line, flue pipe going out the door. So it's not intended to exclude that. The messaging here is intended to give our clients, the actual end user of these contracts, the distinct impression of the home inspection is not for you to renegotiate the deal or start nickel and diming the hell out of the sellers. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. And so it was never, in the previous versions of this, it was never intended to open the door to that. But in fact, we've found out that it was opening the door to that. And we found out a lot of people checked the box and left the seller holding the bag. The next question, with reference to line 95, so we're still in the inspection contingency. Does the $500 or 0.5% cap refer to individual repairs or the total of all? Now, it does use the term in the aggregate. And so the idea here is we have a threshold that must be surmounted before you can open the gate and start asking for stuff that's not 5A2. And another one of this person's questions is, and then what happens if you get into a spitting match over whether it does or doesn't cross that threshold? Well, if you're as old as I now am, you may remember back literally 20 plus years ago when we did have financial thresholds in the contract. They were much, much, much lower. And in fact, you could end up in a spitting match over whether the defects did or didn't cross that financial threshold. I think the consensus judgment was, after 2 generations of contract with no financial threshold, and then seeing where that got us, I think the consensus was we want to have thresholds that, again, help reinforce, along with a lot of this other verbiage, that we intend to set a high-ish bar. And so it is in the aggregate. Yes, you could still get into an argument. My contractor says to do this right, this plus these other items will exceed 0.5%. Or in the case of a $70,000 property, it's going to exceed $500. But it is in the aggregate. And then 5A2, as I've said in the orientation video, 5A2 is a separate category. There is no requirement there for crossing a certain threshold. But in addition, your 5A2 items don't count toward the aggregate of non-5A2 items, helping to get you across the threshold and open the gate to additional 5D, that is non-5A2 warranted requests. And I am glad the person that masterfully wrote these questions is here, so that's good to see. So on line 98, again, further clarifying sort of along this theme of don't nitpick, don't put today's building codes retroactively onto a 50-year-old property. Existing properties are not expected to adhere to current codes, but the question that follows, but are they expected to adhere to the codes that were valid at the time they were constructed? So the big thing is what it says. It's a little less important what it doesn't say. You can't do what a lot of buyers, many of us have experienced, which is it's a 63-year-old house and you're asking for a bunch of stuff that in many cases the inspection report itself uses the word upgrade. Well, it scares the buyer, it scares the skittish first-time buyer, and they suddenly think they're going to die if they don't get the upgrade. But if it's an upgrade, by definition, it's not a defect per se. And so it doesn't mean that it must perform according to the codes at that time. And I guess my best example is I grew up in Rolling Acres, unincorporated rural subdivision. So for the most part, the house and the electrical system and the HVAC systems were all as one would expect for a house built in the 70s. But in those unincorporated jurisdictions, same thing with the unincorporated developments around Mahomet, you would find that they weren't necessarily strictly adhering to the building codes that something inside the municipal boundaries with a building code inspection regime would have implicated. So the key point here is, again, further setting the expectation from a buyer reading through this. I don't get to nickel and dime for trivial stuff, and I don't get to ask for a bunch of upgrades on the basis of, but today's code requires that be done differently. Well, that doesn't give you cause to demand it. And again, it doesn't mean that you won't get into some arguments at some point over whether it is or isn't a qualifying defect. But I think it is pretty clear that you can't just nickel and dime people over $200 of stuff. And I've got a couple of those on the outgoing contract right this minute. 145 and 146. So this is termite, I believe. Give me a second. Yeah, it's termite. So the quoted text there, if the bid is for less than $3,000, the amount of the bid shall be credited to the buyers against the purchase price at the time of the closing. So the question, which is a really good in the weeds question, with the word shall, it does seem like the buyer and it does not seem like the buyer and seller can decide that the amount should be applied as a closing cost credit, a reduction in the purchase price, or the creation of an escrow account to have the repairs completed and paid for by that escrow account. It sounds more like a direction with only one option. Really good observation. However, I think realistically, I don't think anyone's going to care what vehicle we were to use for getting those funds done. And in some cases, especially where a lender's involved, the reality is the lender ultimately dictates it. You can't just have a credit. You can't just have a random repair credit. If you've already maxed out closing cost credit in other things, that may work into my lender, now that we have evidence of active infestation and damage, will not approve this if the repairs aren't actually done. So it's not intended to box people in. And I'm watching the attorneys' heads nod. These are all things that'll go on the running list for future cleanup work. But it appears that they would agree it's not intended to limit. And the reality is, even where it does say a shall, if it boils down to all I got to do is send this to my lender and the lender is going to say, I'm not going to finance you until this is actually fixed prior to closing, then you're going to be forced into a different lane. Okay, so moving down, we're almost done with this list. Attorneys, I'll kick this to you. They're at line 204, 205, and you don't have to answer right this second, but should there be a time limit for the condo association to exercise a right of first refusal? And then the last question from this particular person is on the post-inspection amendment. Quoting that post-inspection amendment, if the agreement deadline in paragraph 5D is passed when this notice of deficiencies in post-inspection amendment becomes fully executed, the agreement deadline will be extended to the date of the last signature below. This person's comment is, this seems to conflict with the language in the residential sales contract, lines 112 to 115, if the buyers don't respond to the parties or the parties don't come to a written agreement regarding the inspection and the buyers have not withdrawn the notice, then the contract shall be automatically terminated. Well, I believe that the rationale was if the parties are a day or 2 or 7 late coming to it, but they have both duly executed that amendment, that is sufficient evidence of intent, the party's intent, to essentially ratify that contract, that shall be deemed to have cured that missed deadline. I'm watching Harold and Daniel. Is that accurate in your estimation? Is that the rationale? Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I don't know if Harold has any other.
Yep, that'll do. Okay, and then one.
Yeah, on the right of first refusal question too. I mean, the condo association is not a party to the contract, so you could put a deadline in, but nothing's going to bind them. What the contract does require is the seller's got to make good faith efforts to get that. And I think that's really all we could do. I mean, if you put a date in there, there's no way to make it stick. So
I agree. My thoughts exactly.
Okay, very good. Thanks, guys. And then one other question that I got earlier today is, okay, so what if somebody says, I want to do a home inspection just for buyer's information, but I don't need a contingency? Well, I guess I would remind everybody that the home inspection contingency, both in the outgoing and in the incoming, is binary. You either have one or you don't. If you need to scale it back, and remember, we've already substantially narrowed the universe of things that you can hit sellers up for, and we've created a much higher bar. Because what was the concern? When you would have agents who would, for very good reason, always do a pre-listing inspection, it was because, no, we're telling you up front about all the warts so that you don't have an inspection contingency. And the reason for you not to have it is because we don't know that you're not going to abuse it. We've disclosed everything and you still throw us over a barrel and try to renegotiate the deal despite our best efforts and our good faith. Well, remember, we've already got this more narrowed down in terms of what is fair game. And we've created this threshold that you must get over before you can even open the gate to certain requests. So in this particular person's scenario, it was, well, we want an inspection for information only, but we realize that if we get that inspection, we can still hit them up for 5A2 items. And what I would say is, well, at that point, it really isn't for information only. It is, in fact, to be used against the seller. So if your buyers are in a situation where I've had agents over the years say, well, are we going to cap it so they can only ask for $500 of stuff? And I would say, well, no, the real rationale is the exact opposite. You really want buyers to have an inspection and an inspection contingency so that if, God forbid, there's something really serious and they learn this is not the deal that we thought it was because this property is in an altogether different condition or has defects that will cost thousands upon thousands of dollars and that weren't readily visible to us and that weren't generally consistent with the age and what we were already able to see, then it's really in case of emergency, break glass and get out. Not to limit the seller's liability, but rather we're not going to nickel and dime you until and unless we get over that higher bar. Okay, I was under the impression we were going to get rid of the second date of paragraph 16. So let me scroll. Okay, so I'll read the full question. I was under the impression we were going to get rid of the second date regarding paragraph 16 regarding diligent effort and notice, aka the loan commitment letter date. Was this discussed? Yes. And here's the thing. Nobody issues final loan commitments. Your final loan commitment is it funds at the closing. And I'll use our pandemic-related lender workflows as the best example of why this isn't really practical. we've seen a proliferation of really, truly 11th hour, last minute employment verifications. So you could have a buyer who had gotten through every step of that financing application and had made it out of underwriting and was subject to only a very small final list of ongoing requirements. Nothing new, no new hurdle, just subject to a final verification that there's been no change in employment or credit, only to find out that they lost their job the day before or day of closing. That's still not going to close. And that's still not fair, that a circumstance beyond the buyer's control if the buyer didn't do anything to scuttle their own financing. So we did discuss it, and there's no really perfect way around it. As one lender in town has said, I'm not going to issue a commitment letter. There is no such thing. What there really is, if it's a lender who issues a pretty clear, detailed pre-qualification letter and with a bulleted list of, and here's exactly what that's based on. So we know, is it somebody who got a lender on the phone and said, I'm telling you my credit score is this and my income is this. What will you approve me for? As opposed to a pre-qualification letter with a long list of conditions and checkboxes saying, this is based on reviewing bank statements, tax returns, pay stubs, credit score, all of those things. And I can give you an updated pre-qualification or an updated pre-approval showing that it's made it through appraisal and a few of the other hurdles along the way to underwriting. But as a practical matter, guys, there's no way until it funds at the closing table that we can realistically force a second deadline. And so since all of our options are imperfect, we didn't really choose to make a final change there. Now, what you can still do is don't be trigger happy with that approval date option. And what I mean by that is don't just mindlessly send out a 7-day notice, which will then be received invariably on a Saturday morning by the purchaser at the mailbox in their bathrobe and pink fuzzy slippers with their attorney not handy. And they're being told via official nastygram, you have 7 days from the date of this notice, either to terminate, citing an inability to get your financing, or to waive your financing contingency, meaning we'll sue your pants off if you find out later on, including a job loss at the last minute, that you can't get financed, right? And we have had over the years, we've had attorneys that will send those out like clockwork. So it's really more an issue. Harold knows. He knows the struggle to be real. So it's more a matter of be strategic and intentional. Keep the lines of communication open, because if you find that, to use an example, somebody dragged their feet and they wasted 2 weeks applying, or they applied, but then they willfully sat on the disclosures that the lender needed to be able to get it to underwriting, and they burned through 2 weeks and now they're hopelessly behind. You certainly do have that if you know, I need you to either get out now, not string me along and always have 7 more days before I can initiate the process of ending this. So just understand there will still continue to be a strategic use of the 7-day notice to get somebody out instead of endlessly stringing you along and persuading you to let them have one more week. But with respect to the way it has been written now or in the past, no, there's not technically a final mortgage commitment. So that's actually a really good question. Other questions, guys, and feel free to unmute. I'm also happy to entertain just feedback in general. Not that we're changing anything substantively right now, but this is always an ongoing process. And I figure at the rate we've been going, we'll be ready for the next revision in Q3 of 2028. Well, this begs the question, what did you log on to here? In the Q&A session.
I guess my biggest concern is regarding the termite. Okay. Because, I mean, it's just always been clockwork that for each transaction, it's something that is done. And now it's more of a variable as whether or not it's going to be ordered. And so then it begs, like, you really have to make sure that you and the lender know as far as which when you will need it. And I guess my concern is, what happens if the lender, if it's not ordered right away or something, and then the lender says, actually, no, we do need this, and then it's past the contingency time frame, then say you order it and it's still on the buyer's dime, but then it comes back that there's termites, then what happens? It's not, who would that fall upon as far as paying for remediation or just...
Okay, so I'm gonna watch Daniel and Harold as I talk through this, because that's a very, very good question. First of all, guys, it's important to recognize that we as realtors, and particularly we as buyer agents, are going to have a little bit of a different burden than we have had in the past. Thematically, what the contract working group sought to accomplish is we sought to get away from a model of you negotiate over price and then everyone's come to terms and your seller's already counting their net proceeds to the penny. Oh, and then they get ambushed with post-inspection demands, which may or may not be reasonable, or so help me, if you don't start opening your wallet again, I'm going to unilateral terminate on you. Well, and that was another step. So then they're recalibrating their proceeds yet again. And then under the old model, the septic and the well could be tested later. And when I sold my mom's house in Weldon a few years back, the system had changed, the requirements had changed so much. Not only did it need a whole new system, but the system was on an altogether different scale. It was like $7,000. And it wasn't something she could say, there's a safety escape valve if it's above X number of dollars. It does now, but the outgoing one didn't. So after the original negotiation, after the home inspection negotiation, still open tab on if it turns up with this, and then also add to that termites. Now, realistically, when you look at the interplay of the financing contingency with the other portions of the contract, if all else fails, buyer says, and let's just assume the buyer's agent is being diligent, do you wish for me to order this on your dime? No, I don't. And you find out 2 steps later, the lender requires it. Well, at that point, if it becomes an absolute condition of the financing, particularly of the financing as correctly identified in the financing contingency, then that's still going to give the buyer a financing contingency escape valve. It isn't necessarily, though, and this is where I'm looking at the attorneys, if you've blown the deadlines in the regular termite provision, it means you can renegotiate over, we're going to walk if you don't address this, but I don't think it's going to impose the automatic requirements. It'll just be the parties can still negotiate over a resolution, because if we don't resolve it, I'm not getting my loan and I will have an out under a different provision.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd say buyers generally don't want to claim for specific performance. So rather than ending up with or sellers generally don't want to claim for specific performance. So rather than ending up with a buyer who just doesn't have the money and saying, well, so sue me, they'll negotiate something. And the framework will be set up there, I think, from the termite report within the inspection period. That'll kind of be a default for them to negotiate from, and hopefully people will be able to work it out.
Now, here's what I would suggest to buyer agents. I would suggest that your standard workflow put the termite as an option in front of all of them. See, we're used to sort of our one-stop shop being our home inspection firms into our current workflow. That's inspection. And then all of them have ended up with radon as a related cottage industry that can be at least ordered through, even if it's technically through a different vendor, ordered at the same place you order your home inspection. I would probably suggest to you that when you're wearing a buyer agent hat, you will want to have a paper trail that always, always, always puts an option for a termite inspection, because you don't want to put differently, just like I would never want to be on record telling a buyer, no, you shouldn't bother with an inspection. I wouldn't want to be on record telling a buyer, oh yeah, you don't need a termite inspection, only to get an angry call a year later when they find out that, to quote the late Hank Spees, it turns out the only thing holding up the structure is that the termites were all holding hands. And so in a case like that, if you're on record saying, no, you don't need a termite inspection, well, obviously at that point, that turns into a, who do we sue about this? So I would suggest that you are going to want to have on that list of checklist items for your buyers. Now that we're under contract, your very next priority is inspections, plural. If you're rural, if you're on a well, if you're on a septic, that means all of those things, and all during the time frame in 5D, and termite. and making sure that you're bringing that up front. We had a lender, I was talking to a lender this morning about the fact that Fannie and Freddie aren't requiring termite inspections. Now, under our outgoing contract, their underwriters know that the contract calls for it, and therefore they ask for it because the contract has it as an automatic seller paid item. So contract says someone's responsible for producing this report, therefore we want to see it. But it's not a secondary market driven guideline. And in the cases where, for example, FHA or VA may still require it, we don't believe that even in a longer closing, because our outgoing contract says between 10 and 30 days prior to closing, we don't believe that most lenders will care if it happens to be 60 or 75 days old in the case of a 90-day closing where the termite inspection was done 10 or 14 days after the date of execution of the contract. Does that make sense, everyone? I'm waiting to see to what degree Jamie's brow unfurrows as my there we go as my means for judging the satisfactory nature of the answer. So when are we expecting to go live with the contract? I need to kick that over to staff to confirm, but I think our plan was to be doing this essentially as early as next week. Is that still in the cards, Linda, or has BOD discussed something different?
The plan is March 1st. We're having difficulty with MRED right now getting those forms up there because of problems of the storms that they've been having. They're trying to get a rush on it. The
now, wait a minute.
Connect is in Austin. So
that was what I was going to say. Downers Grove has really been hit hard.
Yes, Austin, Texas. So that is the plan, March 1st.
Okay. Yeah, Bill?
So looking at the inspection contingency, we have the first date put in there. How would you suggest if we need to bump either of the following dates, if we need to get a couple more days in there, what would be the best way to make some sort of a amendment to that?
Well, that's a good question. So just to refresh everybody's memory, the key change is the parties will still set at contract formation the first deadline, the deadline by which the inspection must be done and any notice of qualifying deficiencies served upon the seller, as well as any 5A2 stuff that is revealed in the course of the inspection. Again, the whole point of these changes was to make sure everything that you could ambush with the seller or keep dropping shoes on the seller over and over and over again throughout the process, seemingly with no end, that all of that was forced within a uniform.
You just slipped to mute, Matt.
Well, I thought somebody would volunteer that before we got to this point. Okay, so just to refresh everybody's memory, I don't know how good I was talking with my hands there. To refresh everyone's memory, we chose to keep a blank that gets filled in for the first deadline for serving a notice and having the inspection done. And remember, that's not just a notice of qualifying deficiencies, but I believe that this now says that if it's a 5A2 item and it is revealed in the course of that inspection, that is to be noticed as well. To Bill's point, if one of the other now pre-baked, predetermined timeline stages, so once you've put in at contract formation, we're giving ourselves until this calendar date to do the inspection, serve the notice. Every other stage of that is now on a preset time horizon. There's nothing that would stop the parties from changing that like they do now. But then I would also go back to the earlier question that was pre-submitted, which is if all else fails, technically the contract may terminate, but if the parties are still at the table and they both sign a post-inspection agreement, that will cure that. So you can do it a couple different ways. Now, there's this issue of, well, if we go out of contract, technically that buyer could go bolt if some other shiny object crosses their field of view in the meantime. In most cases, a buyer, who's this far into it and who signed a contract with the more qualified home inspection, I don't think they were going to find people dropping at the drop of a hat wanting to ditch this one and go after the other shiny object. So I suppose there's a small risk if you've allowed yourself to go out of those and you're technically not under contract. Yes, you can still sign the post inspection. That will cure the lapsed contract retroactively, but it doesn't still mean that if under your particular client circumstances, you may not say, listen, we're about to go outside these deadlines, and so we want to cross through and put calendar dates for these two portions and put it in the margin. And I think that would probably be the most practical. And if anyone has a follow-up question on that, that is a pretty in-the-weeds question. I'm looking now at the chat box. On the inspection contingency, if the repairs do not exceed the aggregate of the greater of 500 or 0.5%, whose bid do we go off of for that? What if we have 7 light bulbs needing changed at the insert former retired contractor price of $75 per bulb versus the homeowner saying they can get the same work done for $50? Well, Curtis, I would remind you that if the non-functioning electrical fixtures are in there, those are 5A2, and those are not, regardless of whether it's that contractor's estimate or the homeowner, those will not count toward the 0.5% or $500 in the aggregate threshold. Yes. But again, we know at some point we're going to get people into a showdown over this contractor says this could be done for this amount of money. Well, mine says it's going to cost more. My higher bid gets us over that threshold. And so we are seeking to renegotiate or to negotiate an inspection related agreement. We know that there will be some gray area there that the parties will just have to hash out. And it's a good reason, in the interest of the local bar association. It's just another good reason to keep your favorite attorney on speed dial.
Can't argue with that.
And I have a question. This is Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for FHA or maybe VA, post-appraisal needs some cure before the loan can be issued, like painting, stuff like that. So who's responsible for that cure for the loan to go through?
So that aspect of this has not changed at all. So whether it was outgoing or incoming, so it's been a while, but I had a condition many years ago it was maybe USDA Rural Development. Bunch of conditions came back. Buyers were literally out in the middle of nowhere at this frame farmhouse with peeling paint, repainting it themselves to get it to pass the reinspection. So ultimately you have a financing contingency in play. That is to say, lender says, we got an appraisal back. It says, if these things aren't done, we won't finance it. So you still have leverage to negotiate it. You can't force it down their throats. Now, in some cases, if it was all along disclosed as it's an FHA loan or it's a VA loan, and the listing agent and the seller are reasonably expecting it'll be subject to those requirements, and the listing agent had properly coached the seller, you may see a request for a GFI to be replaced or for peeling paint to be cured. If you've set realistic expectations, it's not to say the seller won't usually be the one that does those items, but technically it is. Buyer says, I have this contingency that I will exercise if you're not prepared to work with me on satisfying these final conditions. That does not predetermine who does it. It's not as specific as the termite provision that says, if this, then up to this amount, you will do it. It simply becomes a negotiating item. And once again, in keeping with the spirit of not dropping additional shoes of bad news on our sellers farther and farther down the road, there's no one way to dispose of that. That could be a seller that takes a hard line and says, listen, I'll make the premises available for you to come in and swap that out or for you to send your electrician, but I'm not doing it. I understand that you have the ability to walk, citing an inability to get financing if I don't, but I'm prepared to do that. Are you ready to lose the house? Or it could be a risk-averse seller that says, listen, I am not jeopardizing my sale over 2 GFIs and 1 window with peeling paint.
All right, thanks. That's good.
Yeah, good question. So is it just going to be common practice of a buyer's agent to get a written bid for each inspection report? Well, I think here's the thing. You can send that notice, and let me make sure that we're referring to the exact language. I'm looking for, okay, here we go. Specifically excluding items warranted and issues arising with respect to well and water. It doesn't have a written bid requirement to prove that. So there's no burden of proof at that point. So I'm watching the attorneys. I don't believe if you're in a time-sensitive situation, you've just gotten your general home inspection, you haven't had time to get an army of other contractors back to the house, there's nothing in this language that would prohibit you serving the notice. It doesn't mean you won't get pushback from a seller who says, I'm getting a contractor out and I don't believe that you've met the threshold for actually opening this up under the qualifying deficiencies and financial threshold requirements. So that's actually a really, really good question. So doesn't mean that you won't be getting bids for things, but most of us are used to doing that right now. But there's nothing in here that will mandate that you get all of that on top of the inspection done before you can even attempt to serve the notice.
Question?
Yes. Hey, Vicki.
Hi. So, and of course, we can't judge our actions on today's market because today's market is so different than what we're used to seeing. But the way I'm seeing this is that in that notice of the deadline notice for the inspection, that's going to need to be, 2 to 3, maybe even 4 weeks out. And if you're trying to dress up your offer to make it appealing for the seller, sometimes those dates are asked to be shortened up, because they want a quick turnover. But if you're thinking about well and septic and chimney and peeling paint and all this stuff, what would you recommend as far as that notice of deficiency date? Would it be 30 days out? Would it be? Obviously, you can't do 2 weeks out if you've got all these components and all these different happenings, or correct me if I'm thinking in a different light. And
no.
The reason I'm saying this is because we were in business back in the day when my husband would go and make bids, and we were told, make this over $500 so that we can get this. So
yes. Spoken as somebody who has lived through the late 1990s era version of the residential sales contract. Yeah. Okay. So Vicki, I hear exactly what you're saying. So let me just talk through it. And again, I'll watch to see if we get bobbing heads from the attorneys. So part of what has sellers and sellers agents so averse to deals with inspection contingencies and lengthy deadlines is because under the current outgoing contract, you really can't consider the deal done if there is a literal check the box walk away, not just for any reason, literally for no reason at all. I check the box and walk away. And by the way, to meet the requirements, I'm going to send you a nice compiled list of defects. Have fun with that. Good luck. That's part of what has sellers so averse and saying, listen, if we're going to have this inspection contingency, I'm going to lean hard on you to make those deadlines as tight as possible because it's not a done deal and I can't plan my move and make non-refundable deposits while that contingency is hanging over my head. So I think part of what you're concerned about will be largely addressed by the fact that the inspection contingency is so much more narrowly crafted. Think about this. If it's a property that does have thousands of dollars of defects, if it's a $400,000 property, it's got to cross a $2,000 threshold, setting aside 5A2 that won't count toward that, then you're going to have a seller who's also going to be, I tell sellers, I'm going to give you advice based on the any reasonable buyer rule. If any other reasonable buyer would hit you up for these things, then you need to find a way to deal with them with this buyer instead of going back to square one when any other reasonable buyer is going to ask for the same thing. So I think that it may work somewhat to the opposite of what you're thinking. We obviously are going to want to calibrate our deadline based on things like my buyer really, really, really wants to be there in person. They're out of state and they want to use this inspector. Well, you may get pushback from the seller, or you may have a seller that says it's a 90-day closing. And if we're having this conversation in February, I don't care because if it were to fall apart, I'll still be back on the market in March. But you may, just like if we're dealing with reload deals and you got a 10-day or a 7-day and they don't care what season it is, we know what it's like to have to calibrate our timing and our workflow to this. But I don't think we're going to see such a strong aversion. It's this PTSD. I have been beaten bloody so many times by people abusing the inspection contingency that I'm now really, really averse to having one, and certainly to having one that hangs out there for a while. With this being so much more narrowly targeted toward serious problems involving actual defects and actual roof leakage, I think we're going to find that the marketplace adjusts pretty well to this, and sellers feel a lot more comfortable going ahead and making their plans, knowing that if in the case of a 5 or 10-year-old house, realistically, there's no way we're going to have deal-breaking material. And if God forbid something crosses that threshold, we'll have to find a way to deal with it anyway, because any other buyer, if it's that big an item, is going to be hitting us up for it. So I hear exactly what you're saying, but that's so funny because our contract back in the late 90s, a qualifying defect had to be $100, and in the aggregate had to exceed $500. And so, no, that bid isn't quite high enough. I need you just a little bit higher.
Well, and Matt, maybe it's worth pointing out that meeting the $500 threshold, even if it's with an inflated bid, just gets you into the same world you're in with our current contract. You get to negotiate against the backdrop of one party being able to terminate. And so you're no worse off.
It merely opens the door. It doesn't cause a preordained outcome.
Right. So you might have a seller who says, okay, you've given me a bid for $500 to do that work. I'll give you $100. Take it or leave it. Let's get to closing. Yeah.
Or the seller and their attorney say, we've got a bid that we believe is equally reputable that does not exceed that threshold.
Right. Well, and then they'll negotiate over that. Whose bid do we accept? And in negotiating that, the seller might say, well, I'll give you a $100 credit.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, guys?
Another one from me.
Yeah.
Would we see a trend now for listing agents to strongly suggest pre-inspections? Would that be a good route to go if the seller is willing?
Well, it's certainly it's never a terrible idea. The only reason not to real strongly recommend it is, buyers have some skin in the game when they're paying for inspections and sellers don't. But right now, and I'll use Bill Utenage as my poster boy example because he is so consistent, to his great credit. Listen, I'm sick and tired of people jerking my sellers around, renegotiating the deal after they've negotiated the deal once, because we have no idea what they're going to do when anything goes under the outgoing contract's inspection contingency. And so in the case of Bill Utenage, he is extremely uniform in getting virtually all of his sellers to do that in advance. I think, in fact, once the market sort of digests and risk scores all of these changes, my sense is there may be a little bit less of an appetite. Now, it doesn't mean that, like I've got one of Sue's neighbors' houses on the market, it doesn't mean that if it's a house that hadn't changed hands in 30 years, where I'm like, I don't really want to roll the dice on 30 years of possible items since it's changed hands. It doesn't mean that we, as wearing a listing agent hat, won't still say, for your circumstances or your level of risk aversion, or because you're going to have to immediately make irrevocable plans for your move, almost as soon as the ink is dry, that doesn't mean that seller may not be best served based on their own individual risk profile and circumstances by having a pre-listing inspection. But I would suggest that what drives a Bill Utenage to do it all the time, because who knows what they're going to do under the outgoing contract, because that universe of things, put differently, it's much harder to weaponize the new inspection contingency. And that's the best way I can put it. You had people that can most accurately be characterized as weaponizing the outgoing contingency against some poor innocent victim seller. Hey, wait a minute. I've seen that report. When you sent me the unilateral notice, you sent me the report. This is all fixable. This isn't deal breaker material. I'll do it. Nope, don't matter. I checked the unilateral termination box. I'm gone. Can't do anything about it. And some of us, I think Jesse Stauffer in my office probably had the award for having suffered through the most of those in a 12-month period. I mean, it really hurt sellers a lot. So our goal was not to tilt the contract to be anti-buyer and pro-seller. We just had a really palpable sense, and you had a very representative group in the contract working group, this palpable sense of, wait a minute, this is really being weaponized against sellers and is really tilted strongly against them. And a sort of a peer review of other contracts from other local associations really kind of reinforced that. Okay, so another question, do both 5A2 items and qualifying deficiency repair request get sent on the post-inspection amendment? And since both have to be done, I believe, and I'm looking at the attorneys, I believe the answer is yes. The one form will get used to serve, but it'll be only the non-5A2 items that's used to, in the aggregate, cross the $500 or 0.5% of the value of the transaction threshold. Good question, though.
I have a question about that too.
Yeah.
Matt. So when you're serving the notice, would it make sense to like categorize them in regards to like 5A2 and then below that the 5D or whatever it is as far as the non-qualifying items? That way they know, like, this is how I broke this down, and these items are the 500 plus.
Yeah. So to Jamie's point, yes, and there's not a formal requirement of it, but think about it. Don't dump a flaming bag of dog poo on someone else's porch and leave them to sort it all out, to use a colorful analogy. We got to sort through this anyway. If you on the buyer, so again, you put your buyer agent hat on, if you can sort these items out and say, these are the ones that we know don't count toward our threshold, but the 5A2 items that are all legitimate departures from normal working conditions. So we got this set and I got this other set. Absolutely. And even though once on the outgoing contract, once you invoke paragraph 5D, even though the whole thing was up for grabs because the whole contract could terminate, it was still fairly common practice to see buyer's agents somehow highlighting or noting, these are the 5A2 items. These are the things that you're going to kind of have to do no matter what. Now, getting into, sort of the advanced playbook, because if you say no, I can always withdraw my notice right up until the agreement deadline, and then turn right back around and serve a 5A2 notice under the outgoing contract. That practice, by the way, is out under the new one. You can't do that. You have to notify them of 5A2, and if you're opening it up because you've crossed that threshold, you got to plow through it and find a resolution. You can't, I don't believe you would have the ability to take it back and serve an a la carte 5A2 notice under the revised language, but I'm looking at the attorneys.
Yeah, that's right, because you waived whatever condition is noted in the inspection report. Now, if there's something else that you discover after the inspection report that's covered by 5A2, you can still raise it. If it was in the inspection report and you don't raise it by the deadline, it's waived.
And so what that means is the fact that the inspection included the furnace doesn't mean the furnace is off limits. The inspection noted the furnace fired up and heated the house and had no visible defects at the time of the inspection. If there's a change in that condition at the final walkthrough, that remains covered by 5A2. That's the way it has always been. So no change there.
I have another question regarding paragraph 19. So do non-resident, like as far as the affidavit, so is that something that, just because we have such a large population, I just want to make sure that I have this all straightened out.
Now, let me just point out, it's not technically paragraph 19 because very intentionally it is not a numbered paragraph so that it doesn't become a required term of the substantive contract. But so Jamie's talking about the option A or B on the lines right above the signature lines 321 through 328. Okay. So the question.
The sellers agree upon request to execute an affidavit so stating.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, it's called a FERPTA affidavit, Jamie. It is what you would call that.
Okay.
That's
I just don't. Okay.
We don't on residential deals, it doesn't usually come up because we don't typically suspect the sellers are foreign citizens or taxpayers. And then like Chicago Title is the one title company that has the buyers actually sign a document that says, hey, we know you're not withholding any part of the sales price to turn it into the U.S. Treasury. It does occasionally happen on commercial deals. This is the twice in 24 years I've seen it come up. It's been, I think, might have been farmland both times, but these are non-U.S. taxpayers that own real estate in the United States, and Section 1445 of the Internal Revenue Code says that the buyer / closing agent is responsible for withholding, I think it's either 10 or 15% of the gross sales price, turning it into U.S. Treasury to make the foreign taxpayer file a U.S. tax return. So this isn't typically an issue on residential deals, but we do like to have it in the contracts where the sellers do say, hey, I'm not a foreign, taxpayer, corporation, partnership, trust, all this language here. So it's typical language contract where the seller just tells you right up front, I'm not that, and I'll sign an affidavit at closing that says I'm not that.
Now, so to Jamie's point, we used to have this buried in the old contract, but it was just an affirmation. Anyone that executed that contract without marking it up was affirming they weren't a foreign person. And while what Harold described comes up more commonly in commercial deals, a perfectly plausible example that may have come up more than we realized, but they were simply signing a contract that affirmed to the contrary. It is a foreign person under FIRPTA who is visiting with their inbound U of I grad student and pays cash, wires the money over, pays cash for a Capstone Quarters condo for their kid to live in, and then sells it a few years later and does qualify as a foreign person under the act. And so again, if the U.S. government doesn't already have their hand in that person's pocket because they have other reasons they have to file a United States tax return, the idea is in those cases, whoever is closing those is automatically holding back money to trigger a filing. In other words, that foreign person will now have skin in the game. They must file a U.S. tax return and either pay more or get the withholding refunded. So it is an anomaly and will continue to be an anomaly. It's just in that Capstone Quarter example, that's not that far-fetched. We have those folks in our marketplace. We love those folks. We make money from them. Our economy benefits from them. And Rick Wilberg wins the award for being the first to raise a virtual hand.
Well, although Jamie did raise hers on camera.
Right.
Just a quick question, maybe a little too far off topic, and that is we have a pre-printed form for us to fill in the blanks for paragraph 5D on the notice of inspection. Why do we not have a pre-printed form for notice of 5A2? If we're just going to notify them for breach of warranty, I've always had to have the attorney draft this up and send it.
And I'm looking at the attorneys.
So what you're saying?
Okay, so
you don't want to request anything other than 5A2. Is that
Correct.
what you're asking?
Yeah.
And if I can be cynical, Harold, in a way that respects Rick's question, it is, all right, because there's no threshold required on 5A2, I'm not going to risk the contract. Even if I thought I had enough stuff to get over the threshold, I'm not risking this contract. I'm not risking this house. So I'm now going to ask the seller for the items that I'm not really asking. I'm demanding because I'm saying these are seller warranted. I'm not opening up the contract under 5D. I'm simply notifying you of these things that you have no choice but to say yes to. Fair, Rick?
That's exactly right. Yes.
We typically still put it on the your pre-printed and post inspection amendment.
Rick and I would not, because we do not want to, under the scenario we just gave, we don't want to invoke 5D if it is really just asking for items that we intend to be exclusively seller warranted.
Which is why usually the agent will put on there 5A2 items. I've seen that several times. I mean, to me, if you specify it, to me, I don't know. I guess I'd have to go look at the form, but I think if you specified it as 5A2 and you probably tell them in an email, look, these are all 5A2 items. We're putting it on this form because we would like you to acknowledge it. But if it's only 5A2, then sure, you could do it as a notice that says, okay, we're not going to do the post inspection amendment because it's all 5A2. Here's what we expect you to repair, and here's the list. So I don't know. To Rick's question, I don't have a great answer as to why we don't have a form. We could create a form that would be only 5A2, I guess.
Harold, as someone who's been on this committee for an extensive period, this is the first time the question's been asked. And actually, I thought of it when we were discussing this earlier about the difference between 5A2 and other things. So maybe that might be something we as a committee go back and ask for. And I think that would be a simple addition and a logical addition as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So Rick, we agree. It's a good question. Todd Salen has just affirmed that. Here's one other item though. Under the outgoing contract, and a really important change, under the outgoing contract, you could either intentionally or unintentionally blow your 5D notice deadline and still get a second bite at the apple by saying, I missed my deadline, but I'm still going to hit you up for all the 5A2 items. Please note that we have cleaned that up. You cannot do that anymore. So you could still serve a notice of 5A2 seller warranted defects, i.e., I'm not asking you, I'm telling you these are all warranted and only warranted. However, you'll note that 5A2 now has a limitation that says, again, with respect to 5A2, not inspection, written notice of breach of this warranty must be served upon sellers on or before the possession, or it shall be deemed to have been waived. That's the same, except, this is the new part, except that if buyers conduct any professional inspections under paragraph 5D, written notice of any breach of this warranty disclosed in the inspection reports must be served on or before the notice deadline in 5D. So it doesn't give you another bite at the apple if you blow your 5D deadline, but you still could, since most of the time we learn about the 5A stuff in the course of the inspection being done under paragraph 5D. And I don't think if we make a new 5A2 exclusive form, as far as I can tell, that won't require altering so much as a word of the contract.
Right. And the reason I was looking for that is, especially in a scenario in today's market where there's multiple offers and you have a buyer under contract, and then you find out, or you're worried that there's a backup offer in there, and rather than negotiate inspection items, you're sending them a demand letter saying you've already agreed that these will be working, and so sorry to be a jerk, but fix it.
Yeah.
And then Carrie Johnston's scenario was, okay, so let's say, to Rick's point, we waive an inspection contingency altogether as a strategic deal sweetener. And then we ask for access for a home inspection. Well, a seller's attorney may say to the seller, well, listen, you might as well say yes, because if you don't, you're going to get to the point of the non-refundable deposits and the irrevocable plans, and they'll simply bring a home inspector with them to the final walkthrough when they next have an actually contractual right to the access. And you could either be ambushed with 5A2 requests the day before closing, or you can say yes and let them have at it now.
But the key there is, you said 5A2 requests. It's not a request, it's a demand.
Demands.
Right.
Yeah. I guess when I say requests, every once in a while, and the new language is an attempt to further clarify, every once in a while you'll have people make really, really, really nitpicky stuff saying it's under 5A2. Like there's a grommet missing, but everything else on that panel, or where the gas line passes through the furnace cabinet, it all works correctly, but there's a single missing, 75-cent part. Those very, very good questions. Okay, I'm staring at y'all, as many of you as I can make eye contact with. Well, hopefully, as you have all learned more about it, I'm hoping that for most of you, you'll think this will make our deals more certain. This pins down. I mean, you can hopefully tell this is really aimed, the changes were aimed squarely at items that we knew were becoming very common pinch points. So none of these are going to be perfect. All of these are going to take time to sort of figure out how the marketplace adapts and adjusts to them. Vicki, I see your virtual hand up. Is it up again, or is it residually up?
Well, it's all the time. I've got questions always. So under the personal property, we can list appliances, that kind of thing. The built-in appliances, that warranty is there with the personal property. And you might have covered this early on. I was a little bit late getting my audio working. Are those 5A2 items the built-in appliances, or is that a different warranty? Let's say they ask for a portable dishwasher. It's not built in, but it's there, and they've asked for that to stay. So will those items that's listed under the personal property, will they be included in the 5A2, or are they a separate entity of themselves?
So historically, there has been some degree of overlap with similar verbiage separately applied in 5A2 and then again applied in the personal property paragraph. Under 5A2, the qualification is built-in appliances to be in operating condition. And then I'm scrolling down to make sure I'm putting my eyeballs on exactly what this says. And then again, sellers warrant all listed property to be in operating condition upon delivery of premises. So that hasn't changed. We've just changed it from normal working to operating and have tried to make that slightly clearer. But that still means you want to have if you're wearing a listing agent hat, there's no really, really bright line test here. So the most common thing is the ice dispenser, through the door ice dispenser hadn't worked in 5 years. The fridge and the freezer work. I've never thought about it. Well, that's still going to be a point of argument over whether that is or isn't operating condition. It is under 5A2. Clearly, it's performing, the refrigerator and freezer performing the primary function for which they're intended, but there's still going to be some gray areas here. But that does mean if you're a seller and you preemptively ask your seller's agent and you preemptively start asking those questions, step into the confessional. Do you have any stove burners that don't light regularly, or where you have to turn on the lighter on this one to get that one to light? Stuff like that and I say that because that's the way my stove is, and I've never bothered having it fixed because I have muscle memory. I could do this with my eyes closed. But that's exactly the sort of thing that comes up where that one burner is not operating exactly the way it's intended, but I've never bothered to call for a service call because I can work around it. But, we're always going to have some of those items. I should have brought filler music. Filler music, Jeopardy theme song music to fill these gaps. And here's the thing. The elite handful of you that are here are now going to be in charge of answering all the questions for the agents back at your offices. So we are recording this. This session is going to be shared widely. When it's shared, everyone can wish that nobody had told Matt that he was muted.
Jamie, why don't you sing a cappella?
All right, so guys, we're going to plan on revisiting this as circumstances warrant. So we want to make sure that to the best of our ability, we equip all of you to plan for your workflow adjustments. The biggest workflow adjustments you're going to have are all of us when we're wearing buyer agent hats have to run through the entire list of possible inspections and make sure you're getting your buyers to tell you if they're going to do that, knowing that you still have the benefit of a financing contingency, but it's not the same as sellers shall pay for this when you blow your inspection deadline. So that's the single biggest workflow change. By all means, continue to let CCAR staff and or Max McComb and me know as you're seeing things, because we'll do another one of these sessions. We appreciate the attorneys' ongoing collaboration, willingness to put their heads together with ours. So if we find out that there's a whole new set of questions once the rubber actually hits the road, we will be back to offer more, because it's our responsibility to make sure all of you are as well equipped in the field as you possibly can be. And as I say during the contract orientation, we are a unique business. Those of you, including those in my own firm on this call, are all competitors of mine, and yet my job and my life are meaningfully better when you all are doing your jobs well. So it's in all of our interest, and it makes the industry look its best. So keep us posted if you find out that there's new stuff, and we want to keep the dialogue going and make sure that we have continued forums for sharing this with the entire membership. So on behalf of that contract working group, on behalf of the attorneys who have been kind enough not only to volunteer their will to live during the process that's led up to this, but Harold and Daniel to be here for this on no notice, thank you, thank you, thank you. And we hope that you enjoy what we believe are improvements as much as those of us who have toiled over it think that we are going to enjoy it. So have a great afternoon, guys.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Daniel.
Matt.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you, attorney.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Peace out.